Così, in occasione...
Well, příležitosti našeho prvního zasedání je mi opravdovým potěšením přivítat vás.
And as such, we are kicking off a little bit late, but from now on, I think we're going to have to start arranging things so that we can start punctually. Our agenda. Item 1, adoption of the agenda. If there are no objections, then I think hopefully we can adopt the agenda without changes. I now have a whole series of announcements. The first has to do with interpreting. Today, we have interpreting available in 23 languages, and the multilingual approach is, of course, characteristic of the way that the European Parliament works, and as such, we will always try to have as many languages available as possible for our committee meetings. But, of course, it will depend on the availability of the interpreters, and it may be that occasionally we will have to hold our meetings in rooms where there isn't space for all of the booths. And if that's the case, I'm sure you'll be understanding if there are a few languages less. Now, you're aware of the fact that we do have to try and reduce costs too. So I would ask all committee members, therefore, that if they're not going to be able to attend a meeting, that they tell the Secretariat in advance, because that means that we can, in fact, reduce the number of languages planned for the meeting, if that would be appropriate, which would have a knock-on effect, obviously, on the costs. Now, secondly, on the web streaming of the work done in our committee. Well, we will just continue with what was the case before, i.e. our meetings will be web streamed. Now, as you know, the Environment Committee is the committee that's responsible for trying to reduce the use of paper in the Parliament. And that would be why, as members of the committee, you can choose not to have paper copies of documents, but instead to have copies on the internet, e-copies. So, if there are colleagues who are happy to not receive paper copies and would prefer to do everything online, then please inform the Secretariat of that.
Pacchetto di benvenuto alla...
Then, we also have a welcome pack. Welcome to the committee. And you should find that at the front of the room. It's available in different languages, in all of your native tongues. Now, should have been handed out, and in the welcome pack there's an introduction to the Environment Committee. And there's information too, which we hope will be useful on the legislative procedure in the European Parliament. And a series of information too on the activities that we'll be carrying out in this 8th legislature. The e-version of the handy welcome pack is available on the internet page of our committee. We've put it online as of today. The next announcement is one that it's a pleasure to make. As has generally been the case, this afternoon, 15 minutes before we start our meeting, i.e. at 2:45, we will have the family photo taken. In other words, of all the members of the committee. So can I ask everybody to turn up, please? Obviously, all hairs in place, smiles for that photo, because that will be used on many occasions, and the photo will be taken in the committee's meeting room. Then the next meeting of this committee will take place on the 3rd of September, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning and then carrying on in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. But the meeting that was planned for the 4th of September has been cancelled. So, having said that, I think we can now move on to the next item on our agenda, which is Chair's announcements concerning coordinators' recommendations. On the 14th of July in Strasbourg, the coordinators met, and the minutes of that meeting have been sent out to all of you and is now available as one of the meeting files. And we haven't received any comments from the political group's coordinators, and as such the minutes are deemed available and adopted and are available to everybody as a meeting file in e-format. So that means I can move on to the next item of the agenda, which is the general budget for the financial year 2015. And considering that I was in the Budgets Committee before, the coordinators very kindly, therefore, as I was General Rapporteur for the budget, have asked me to draw up the opinion for our committee. And again, that was sent to you via email yesterday, just in English, because we really didn't have very much time available to us. So perhaps I can just comment on the draft opinion that we've drawn up then for the Budgets Committee on the 2015 budget. In the draft opinion, first of all, I've underlined the allocations in terms of both payments and commitments for the next budget. And as always happens with the commitment appropriations, they're higher than the payment appropriations. And in the past, we've had an increase of the RALs, the resta liquide. In other words, those payments that accumulate over the years and that still need to be paid, that are pending. Now, in the budget, we've identified headings for subject areas that fall within the remit of this committee. And we've also identified the fact that, in particular, when it comes to some programs, there is the possibility that because the payment appropriations are limited, there could be a problem. And in the opinion, if you look at the 7th point, we've said that for the LIFE programme, for example, if you compare that with the last year's budget, we do have an increase of 23.3 million for the environment and 7.2 million for climate change. But while that increase for the environment, for climate change, should be sufficient to cover all of the requirements for 2015, the part dedicated to the environment does seem to show a lack of payment appropriations to cover all of the needs for 2015, which will mean that in October 2015, if we remain with the appropriations currently in the budget for this budget line, we will have a shortfall of payment appropriations. And that's why, in the opinion, we've asked the Commission and the Council to reassure us that sufficient resources will in fact be maintained in the budget, perhaps through an amending budget, so as to make it possible to ensure that we have cruising speed for the environment programmes throughout the whole of 2015 without there being any abrupt breaks as a result of lack of payment appropriations. Then other points that have been identified in the opinion: the agencies. Now, as you'll know, there is a plan in the Commission over the next 5 years to introduce a 5% reduction in the staff that work in all of the Commission services, including the agencies. Now, this could cause some agencies some difficulties, particularly when it comes to those agencies that are in fact involved in external activities and who therefore are financed to a certain extent not by the European budget but are financed to a certain extent directly from fees that are paid to the agencies for their services. Now, that means then some agencies could find themselves in difficulties. And that's why we have, in fact, highlighted that this could be a problem for two agencies in particular. And we have also listed the possible problems that could result from a reduction in the appropriations made available to the agency. Plus, finally, we've underlined the importance attached by the Environment Committee to pilot projects and preparatory actions, which are obviously very useful in the run-up to legislative activities, and so we have pointed out that pilot projects and preparatory actions in fields linked to the activities under the remit of our committee should in fact be financed properly in 2015. So, that is a summary then of the opinion that I've drawn up on your behalf. And now I will immediately pass the floor to the Commission. And we have here representatives from the Commission with us. François Cassana from the Aid Finance Unit from DG Environment has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just a few words, first of all, given that this is a new committee, and a few words therefore about the budget. We've got, in terms of commitment appropriations, a little fewer than in previous years, and it's an overall budget of 46 billion. It may seem very small, but this is only the visible part of the iceberg, because there is expenditure that is dedicated to the environment and fighting climate change in other policies of the European Union, primarily the regional funds, research policy and external relations policies. And we don't have a very clear detail on that, but we reckon it's about 15% of the community budget that ought to be considered green, and we've set up a traceability system for this expenditure in our fight against climate change on the one hand, and also when it comes to preserving biodiversity. This budget for the environment is 80 to 85% represented by the LIFE program, contributions to international organizations working in the field of the environment, and also by contributions to the agencies, as the chairman was just saying, through these pilot projects and preparatory actions. For 2015, the draft Commission budget follows the basic lines of the multi-annual guidelines for agency expenditure. The Copenhagen Environment Agency is considered to be at cruising speed now, and so we follow closely constraints imposed on those types of agencies. And it is true that for 2015 we have a few concerns about the level of payment appropriations, as the chairman was saying at the outset, compared with what we think we're going to need. And as of October, if our forecasts are right, we will be likely to run into payment problems, and we will be likely then to have transfers in from other budget lines. But it's the whole of the Commission, effectively, that's in that state of affairs in any case. Secondly, for 2015, our contributions to the chemicals agency in Helsinki, and for biocides this applies, and the contributions to that agency are fees paid by companies that register their products, but they are turning out to be far less than had been foreseen. And for 2013 and 14, we had to pay one-off payments to help them out. For 2015 now, we're likely to continue to see a reduction in fees, and for 2015 we ought therefore to try and come up with a more sustainable long-term solution to the shortfall problem there. Another important issue for 2015 is that it's going to be the second year of the multi-annual financial framework, but effectively it's going to be the first year in which it is running, and where there are two new elements. The first of these is the delegation of the major part of the LIFE program and the management of that program to an executive agency. This is the SME agency. And the second thing here is the use of financial instruments, because money from the European budget is going to be invested in financial instruments managed by the European Central Bank, whether that's to support programs to fight climate change or to support biodiversity. Those are the main aspects that I wish to bring to your attention about the budget. And maybe, having said that, I'll give the floor to my colleague Guido de Klerk, who's going to tell you about the current budget situation. When it comes to consumer protection and the public health program and the animal and plant health program, if we look at the total, it's about 8 million split between public health, animal health and plant health, and the three regulatory agencies, EFSA and EMA. For commitment appropriations, it's the second year of the multi-annual programming period, and for public health and animal protection, we have the three regulatory agencies, and the amounts for commitment appropriations correspond with the amounts in the Commission's communication from July 2013. For payment appropriations, we find ourselves in a very similar situation to the one outlined by our colleague talking about climate change. That's to say, the amounts here are being kept within the ceiling of the financial perspectives, and for this year there is likely to be a small problem on the payments appropriation side, but it will depend very much on the timing and the implementation of the budget. So once the commitments get somewhat deferred, and you may not need the payments to be made at exactly the same time, but so we'll have to see as this budget is executed exactly how it pans out. When it comes to the regulatory agencies and staffing levels, We know that the Commission has basically decided to apply a 1% cut to the regulatory agencies' budgets, but at the same time to try and get the allocation between agencies. This 1% is to be applied across all the agencies, all three of them.
Grazie. Adesso
Thank you. There are requests for the floor. Mr. Uitema.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your report. My compliments. I just wanted to say few things. Also, what the Commission already said, and also what you were saying between the gap between commitments and the payments. I think it's very important that the Commission should focus more and to spend more in a focused manner to prevent that gap and to bring down this gap. Then as well about the agencies, I welcome very much the greater role of the Executive Agency for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, because it will foster entrepreneurship and innovation that is badly needed to tackle environmental issues and keep also our industries leader in green technologies. And then I would like to welcome also the greater role of the European Investment Bank that will help financing innovative products such as the natural capital financing instrument. And then about DJ Sanko, it's good that the Commission is here from DJ Sanko as well, because I'm quite worried about the lack of funding for contagious animal diseases, like for example the outbreak of swine flu. The outbreak of swine flu cost in the UK alone already 1 billion euros, and we have only in reserve 400 million euros. So that's also a big gap, and that's something that I'm very worried about. So that are my points. Thank you very much.
grazie.
Thank you. Mr. Jutta.
Mal an Sie als Berichterstatter.
Well, thank you. As rapporteur for the ENVI committee, you've only really had a week, and obviously you put a lot of work into that ahead of time, but just a few words about the agencies. As far as the agencies are concerned, we're giving them ever more work, but we're not following that up with money. And we've got a 5% haircut on the staffing. And we've discussed this on many times in the past in the committee, and Jutta Haug was our rapporteur. And now we're facing these problems. So what I would say is that we need to take these issues more seriously in the future, because every time we talk about the agencies, this issue comes up. The aspirations are far removed from the wherewithal. And this is something that we need to manage flexibly for this period, but we also need to have an open ear for these agencies. These are companies registering products with ECHA or with EMA, and they pay fees, and the fees are something we need to discuss as well, but they have a reasonable claim to needing their applications to be dealt with fairly, and we need to keep our eye on what's happening with the staffing levels.
Thank you, Mr. Gebrandi.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me also congratulate you with your first report in this Environment Committee. I have two questions, budget related, and I would like to have some input from the Commission there. First considers biodiversity. Based on its own communication, the Commission calculated that we need roughly 5.8 billion euros a year in order to obtain our objectives that are written down in our biodiversity strategy. I tabled a few written questions just before the election break, and the answers were quite astonishing. That I asked not about the European budget, because that is clear and transparent. I asked about the budgets for biodiversity at member state level. And the picture is clear. The Commission has no clue about the budgets in the different member states on biodiversity. So my question to the Commission is, what's the next step? How are we going to obtain the objectives of our biodiversity strategy? Because a 3.46 billion euros in the LIFE program in 7 years is not even enough for 1 year in Europe, and it's absolutely clear that we're not willing to take over the responsibility for biodiversity from all the member states. So maybe the Commission can elaborate on what it's planning to do to put more pressure on the member states to be more transparent on their budgets on biodiversity. My second question relates biodiversity. It's on the agri-environment. Last year I tabled with the ALDE group in the Budget Committee an amendment to put a considerable amount of the agri-environment budget in the reserve. We used to have in the previous MFF about 2.5 billion euros a year in the agri-environment scheme. I'm not absolutely certain how much the amount is now, but I think it's not far less than the 2.5 billion. If you compare that to the 7-year budget for LIFE, you see the huge difference. But according to the European Court of Auditors, the environmental benefits of this yearly 2.5 billion euros is completely unknown. And it might be extremely limited. What I wanted last year in the Budget Committee is to put the agri-environment budget, 10% of it in reserve, and to make it available only when the environmental benefits are being shown by either the Member States or the European Commission. What are the developments since last year? Because I don't think that we should spend so much money on something that has so little relevance for the objectives of the budget line. Thank you.
Adesso la parola.
I'll now give the floor to Mrs. Girling.
Thank you, Chairman, and let me also congratulate you on getting this out to us so quickly. Having said that, of course, we haven't had a huge amount of time to look at it, but can I just make a couple of points from my group's point of view? Firstly, I think we should have a recognition somewhere that member states and member state governments are under increased stricture to reduce spending and to bring their fiscal situations under control, often at the behest of the EU and the Commission, and that this should be acknowledged because it's crazy, I think, to say that the environment budget should remain entirely unaffected by that. Of course, it's like every other part of a government's budget. It has to be looked at in the round. And on that subject, I think I would like to see a little bit more rigour and a little bit less ring fencing in the language, because every single committee will say that the work that they do is the most important and needs to be ring fenced and needs to be protected. I'd like to see an acknowledgement in the budget that we should be setting priorities, but also acknowledging that there are other issues which are of less priority, which will allow us, therefore, to spend on our priorities. It's not a question of just piling on more and more spending. And when we deal with legislation and regulation in this committee, we're often told that they're budget negative. There will be, budget neutral. There'll be no effect. And then a couple of years later, when we're looking at budgets, we're told that the agencies can't cope, for example. And I think we need to be much more rigorous in going back to the agencies and finding out why budget neutral seems to have become unavailable, and we're now costing more money. There will be things that the agencies are doing that perhaps they shouldn't be doing. And if we do, as Mr. Gruter said, keep piling work onto them, then we need to think about their workloads and where we could perhaps take some work away. So I would like to see that there could be alternative and additional savings made at the agencies. We've only talked explicitly in here about 5% reduction in staff costs, but there are also possibilities of reduction in their communications budgets and indeed their entire mission budgets. So With those points, we will be making a few amendments on those. I thank you again for your opinion.
Grazie. Adesso la...
Thank you. Mr. Leinen.
Ja, danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The EU has a lot of international climate protection commitments it's entered into months ahead of the election. I heard, in fact, that we were running out of money with regard to living up to those commitments. Maybe the Commission should just say a few words about that.
Grazie. Ms. Grostet.
Thank you, Mrs. Grostet.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just like to come back to the agency problem, and the one I know best is the European Medicines Agency in London. We have for years been telling them that they need to do more and that they need to take on a heavy burden of responsibility. And I don't think then that we should be thinking about removing some of those responsibilities, because this is pharmacovigilance, the authorizations for placing pharmaceuticals on the market. Well, we know that there are some medicines, particularly innovative ones, which must go through placing on the market assessment by this agency. And what I'd like, because every year when we have the budget, we have to fight to make sure that the agency gets the budget it needs. And we see, as time goes by, that the work of the agency is becoming ever more burdensome, and we keep saying, quick, 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 get on with it. So maybe there are agencies where we could lighten things, but certainly not in the case of the Medicines Agency. I think there are some of us that need to ensure that the budget for that agency really does allow it to keep an eye on public health for all the citizens of Europe, and also to provide a safety guarantee for medicines.
Grazie. Adesso
Thank you, Mr. Ricauta.
Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for the opinion. I have a very simple question. I mean, in the previous times when Jutta Haug was always taking the honors, one of the most important things she did was always restoring the draft budget. So there were a lot of amendments on the budget lines to restore the draft budget. And my question to the rapporteur would be if you are still intending to do that as well, or do you expect that from the members? Thank you.
Non essendoci altri interventi, adesso...
Since there are no further requests for the floor, I'll ask the Commission in a moment to provide their answers. But I would say clearly, as we've always done, the draft budget from the Commission contains both commitments and payments. Very often, Council makes a cut to payment appropriations to keep overall spending down, often in a linear fashion and failing to take into account the specific needs of individual programmes. And I would simply like to look at containing spending by member states as a whole. The Commission forecasts are weighted, and they take into account the need for operational programmes run by each agency, and each programme more generally has. In a rational fashion, I'll present all amendments to restore the draft budget in line with the Commission forecasts, and then when negotiating the budget, it will be, in this case, the Budgets Committee that will try and negotiate with Council to achieve an agreement in conciliation at the end of the day. As far as the other questions that were raised, there were a number of specific questions to the Commission. I'll give the Commission, therefore, the floor so that they can reply according to the areas they're responsible for.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll answer the two questions that were put to me about biodiversity and agri-environmental issues. On biodiversity, first of all, and this hidden part of the iceberg I mentioned before. Well, the Commission is going to set an example here, as I said, because 2 years ago we set up a traceability system for the expenditure covering the whole of the community budget in this area. When it comes to the Member States' budgets, what the Commission can do, and this is what the Court of Auditors proposed in its report on biodiversity, is ask Member States to report on their expenditure, and they will give them a methodology to enable those reports to be consistent one to the other. I don't know what else the Commission really could do vis-à-vis the Member States. On the agri-environmental measures, I think we should be pleased to note recent trends in evaluation of budgetary expenditure, where we've moved from calculations and controls based on legality and regularity of the expenditure towards looking at performance and the real impact of that expenditure. And the Court of Auditors has, in particular, been carrying out and producing more specialised reports, and they've done it in particular on agri-environmental measures and on biodiversity and on expenditure for water as part of the Common Agricultural Policy, and they've also produced a report on climate change. Even though we don't always agree with the Court of Auditors and we have a bilateral discussion procedure when we do those reports, we nevertheless follow recommendations that the Court gives us, and we follow up the recommendations that they supply. And this will be presented to your committee and to the Parliament as a whole. Now, on international climate commitment, I'm going to give the floor to my colleague.
Chairman, in relation to the international climate agreements where we pay an annual contribution or a fee, if you want, to the Secretariat, well, there are 5 of these conventions. We pay a contribution to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There is also the Kyoto Protocol. There is an accounting tool for emissions registrations. We pay a fee to. There's the Vienna Convention, and finally the Montreal Protocol protecting the ozone layer. Altogether, we're talking about 850,000, in between 800 and 850,000 on an annual basis. We've already paid these contributions in 2014, so our debts have been paid, and we ensure that they will be paid also next year if the budget is kept at the level that we proposed. Thank you, Chairman.
Prego.
Go ahead.
So the question on the swine flu, the common financial framework has been published on 27th of June of this year and entered into force on the 30th of June. And this is the document which is fixing the rules and the eligible costs for the eradication of the animal diseases. And it's up to the member states to introduce in due time their programs. It's an annual system. And therefore, of course, financing is there foreseen for the list of recognized animal diseases.
Grazie a tutti per il contributo.
Thank you everybody for your contributions. Let me just remind you of the deadlines. As you know, the budget procedure this year is much more truncated because it's an election year, and so the time available is very little indeed. The deadline for amendments for the budget is therefore set for tomorrow, the 24th of June, 4 p.m., July, 4 p.m., and the deadline for amendments for the opinion will have to be worded in English alone. The vote, however, will be taken in the meeting of the committee on the 3rd of September. The only thing that I need to add to that is that all the proposals for pilot projects and preparatory actions must be retabled as budget amendments by tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. And on that basis, I think we can move on to the next agenda item. This is preparations with a view to the UN Climate Conference, September 2014. As you know, on the 23rd of September, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, will be holding a climate summit on the margins of the UN General Assembly. The summit has been organized with the aim of mobilizing political commitments ahead of the climate conference to be held in Lima and Paris in December 2014 and 2015, respectively. The Secretary-General of the United Nations has invited governments, civil society and so on to propose ambitious projects to the summit with a view to achieving the climate change goals. We have DG Climate's Director General, Joost Delbeke, representing the Commission, obviously, who will take us through the state of progress in terms of the summit's preparations. And obviously he'll answer any questions that members of the ENVI committee may care to ask him. So 10 to 15 minutes for the Director General, Joost Delbeke, for that presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure for me to be here in the new ENVI committee under your chairmanship. This is a very important committee. It has been very influential in the past, and we look very much forward to work with you in this legislature. Let me focus on 2-3 points on the Ban Ki-moon summit. But the most important element is where to put the importance of the Ban Ki-moon summit in the international negotiations on climate change. This is going to be the first meeting of the world leaders since Copenhagen in view of preparing the new international climate agreement of Paris that is going to be concluded, as we all hope, in December 2015. And so what is going to be said and happen in the Ban Ki-moon summit is going to be very important in view of preparing that international agreement. So I would like to spend a few words on where we are on that new international climate agreement. We know that the scientists, as they expressed their collective opinions in the IPCC reports issued in 2013, they have said that without control of greenhouse gas emissions, impacts by the end of the century are projected to include a global average temperature of between 2.6 and 4.8 centigrades higher than present. And so we must prevent this from happening, and we need a global climate agreement to limit the global temperature increase to below 2 centigrades maximum, as was already agreed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so in 2011, it was agreed to prepare for a new global climate agreement by 2015 to limit exactly this temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. Crucially for us, but also for many other states, is that for the first time, this agreement should be applicable to all parties, and not just to the so-called Annex I parties, because this Annex I definition dates already back from 1992. To ensure success, the EU needs to continue its leading role in pressing for an ambitious outcome, especially from all major economies. And in Warsaw, last year, it was agreed that major economies would table their contributions to the new agreement by March 2015. This would allow for 8-9 months for an assessment against the below 2 centigrades objective before the final agreement in December 2015 in Paris. The EU will meet this deadline with the 2030 framework that is currently being discussed by our heads of state, and that is planned to come to a conclusion in October of this year. Encouraging news also comes from the US, that is now finally legislating its power plants, and also encouraging news comes from China, discussing a possible peaking date for their emissions. Other major economies, such as Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa, Canada, Australia, and others, still need to confirm that they will come forward in the first quarter of 2015, well ahead of the negotiations in Paris. So that is now the importance of the UN Secretary-General's Climate Leaders Summit. It is a key step on the way to the next round of the negotiations, which is in December of this year in Lima, just 12 months before the Paris conference. Even though the UN Secretary-General Summit is separate from the UNFCCC negotiations, it will obviously have a very important impact. And so the Secretary-General has urged world leaders to attend the summit and to be willing to make bold announcements on future action on climate change. Especially important is that, that all major economies demonstrate their commitment to ambitious emission reductions in the 2015 agreement, and for the poorest developing countries to have reassurances on adaptation support and climate finance. The EU will be represented by my President Barroso and by many EU heads of state and government. Commissioner Hedegaard will be present, and many environment ministers will also be travelling to New York. We understand that more than 100 heads of state and government are going to be there, including those from China, from India, Brazil, Mexico. They all have already confirmed their attendance, and it looks quite likely that also President Obama is going to attend. So the EU must likewise be fully represented by our heads to signal our leadership and our determination on climate change. So what is it that the EU then wants to achieve at the summit? Well, the most important probably is that world leaders must reaffirm their commitment to reaching an agreement in Paris and meeting an agreement that leads us below the 2 centigrade degree target. The EU will confirm our commitment to table our 2030 target by the first quarter of 2015, and will press other major economies to do likewise, as was agreed in Warsaw. So the EU will also demonstrate that as far as our commitments for 2020 are concerned, not just as home, but internationally, we already are fulfilling all our commitments, and we will possibly surpass our 2020 targets by the time we are getting there. Today, we are close to reaching the 2020 targets, as we have probably reduced our emissions by 18–19%, while our target is 20% reduction by 2020. We also hope that we will be able to forge strong and effective partnerships with developing countries across the world, because lots of our development cooperation money is being spent in those countries, such as through the Global Climate Change Alliance. The summit must signal a political understanding on climate finance and support the challenges related to adaptation, in particular in the most vulnerable and poor countries. By the way, the EU also intends to reiterate its commitment to ensure access to sustainable energy for all by 2030, by showing and reconfirming its commitment to a global phase-out of HFCs, by showing and reiterating its commitment to the ending of fossil fuel subsidies, and to reaffirm our commitment to carbon pricing. So, after the Ban Ki-moon summit, and we prepare for the negotiations in the context of the UNFCCC in December of this year in Lima. And so I assume that many leaders will make references to what should be done not only in Paris, but what our negotiators should do in Lima. And as far as we are concerned, we think that it is high time to see in Lima all the elements of a draft negotiation text with regard to mitigation, adaptation, finance, transparency, the global assessment process, and other elements important for one or the other, such as on forestry. This should also include a decision on the scope of countries' so-called intended contributions, so what they are planning to do by 2030, and an upfront information requirement for these. Lima should also put in place arrangements for the international process to consider and analyse the intended contributions before Paris. There is broad recognition amongst parties that the primary focus of this intended nationally intended contributions, these are very new abbreviations that are popping up in the climate negotiations, the so-called INDCs, the commitments to reduce emissions. And that should be the most important element of the negotiations, that is, what is going to be done to reduce emissions, mitigation in other words. But alongside that, we also have to create scope for issues related to adaptation and on finance. Last point on finance, Lima will have to show demonstrable progress on climate change, because especially the issue on the capitalization of the Green Climate Fund is going to be on the table. So in short, the Ban Ki-moon summit should create new impetus for the climate negotiations, in particular in view of Paris 2015, but the major step towards Paris in 2015 is the next negotiation round in Lima end of this year, and so having the focus on those two elements should bring us a major step forward towards that global agreement in which all parties are going to take commitments to reduce their emissions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Grazie, Direttore.
Thank you very much, Director. There are a number of colleagues who've asked for the floor, starting with Mr. Lisa on behalf of the EPP.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joost de Belka. I'd just like to say from the EPP point of view that it's very important, as you were saying, that all emitters should make sure that they are subjected to an international agreement, and I think it's been an important step forward in the process and now has to be finally hammered home in Paris. I'd just like to ask Joost Benke to tell us about developments in China and the US. I'm sure this is a bit of a curate's egg. We know that there is an emissions trading system in China, and to some extent in China the CO2 price is twice as high as it is in the EU at the moment. And I'd like to understand a little bit more too about what the US is planning in this regard, certainly with regard to the reduction of CO2 emissions from power plants. What is important is that in all of these plans, energy-intensive industry must be on our minds, and with the agreement we mustn't be so unrealistic as to push industry sectors too hard. I mean, we need to make sure that everybody is subjected in all corners of the world to the same commitments. We need to think about carbon leakage, of course, but there is a difference here, because if you're talking about cement or lime, which you can't produce without CO2 emissions, that's one thing, but there are others where you can push the technology. I'd also like to know how far we've come down the road with ratification of the second commitment period for Kyoto. Now, it's all rather unsatisfactory at the moment because only the EU is participating, but these are commitments that we have entered into, this 20% reduction by 2020 commitment, and I think for our international credibility it's important that we now ahead of Paris, managed to get that signed, sealed and delivered. And I'd like to know how far we've come in that process and where we may need to give it a little extra shove. And the final topical issue is that today the European Commission is going to be announcing its strategy for 2030. We haven't had the energy efficiency part of that hitherto, and it's been rather worrying to hear that the Commission is only thinking about 25% energy efficiency by 2020. I mean, that's going to be achieved under all circumstances, with or without further measures. Parliament's been calling for 40%, and I'm realistic enough to know, despite the fact that we've studies to back us up, that we're not going to get that 40%, but I would nevertheless hope that the Commission could put a figure on it today which goes far beyond the renewable energy one. Energy efficiency is far more effective, and if we wish to achieve our energy goals in a cost-effective way, then we need to focus on energy efficiency much more so than on renewable energy. And as far as electricity is concerned, we wouldn't need any new power lines, power stations, storage, etc. to achieve that. So it's a very cost-effective way of doing things, and surely better to spend our money in Europe in that way, and technology in our buildings, etc., in these difficult times, rather than send the money to Gazprom. So I'd very much like to know what the Commission is thinking about that, and where those discussions are going.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the S&D Group, Mr. Leinen has the floor.
Ja, danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chairman. The Director has paid us a compliment. The work of the European Parliament has been described by extraordinary by him in respect of climate change. That's true. We were always the driving force on these issues. And I can return the compliment. The work of the Commission was also very good. The problem areas were always with the governments of the Member States. The Council has mostly watered down our proposals, and we'll have to see what happens en route to Paris in that respect. The road to Paris is the second opportunity we have to conclude a global agreement after the Copenhagen fiasco. We, as Europeans, are again hosts of a major COP, and I think at the second attempt we have to make this work, otherwise we'll lose so much time that we'll hardly have any other opportunity to achieve a limitation to 2 degrees Celsius. So that's my first point. The UNFCCC and all scientists say that by 2020 we're going to have a gigaton gap. 10 million tons of CO2 reductions will not have been made, and we've always hoped that here the EU would give a further signal alongside our 2020 climate package that we've almost achieved now. We're at 19% CO2 reduction in 2014, and we'd hoped that on the way to Paris we could say we can do more, and we are doing more, and we're gunning for 25, or as we'd wished, 30%. The road to Paris, in fact, has to be all-inclusive. All the countries in the world have changed since 1990. Most CO2 emissions are now from the threshold economies, and there is some hope that China is moving, and I hope that India and other countries will follow suit. It will be less than we had hoped in Copenhagen. A world climate treaty with binding goals. Well, now we're talking about nationally intended contributions, which of course is a much softer formulation. Countries will say what they wish to do without being bound to do it. And my question to the Director would be, how do we make this watertight so that we end up with at least a halfway binding commitment? Otherwise, I would doubt that we'll have anything more than fine words. and the result won't be so good. You have to ask questions about money going into the Green Climate Fund. I feel a little uneasy here imagining that hundreds of billions of dollars have to be stumped up by us every year. That's not going to happen under public budgets. There are experts in innovative financing blueprints, but you don't hear much or see much about it. I wonder if the director, knows anything about it. Lastly, we're only going to protect the climate if, alongside classic mitigation measures, we also tackle other things. For example, reduction in subsidies to fossil fuels. And the same would apply to HFCs, which are carbons polluting the fluorocarbons are polluting the environment, and also carbon pricing, which is something which is on the mat, needs to be stepped up. Additional measures are required, otherwise we just won't make this work. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gebhardt.
And thank you, Jos Delbeke, for his clear presentation. Let me rephrase that. I was looking forward to the summit, the Ban Ki-moon summit in New York, but now and if I quote him well, the main objective was, according to Jos Delbeke, that world leaders must reaffirm their commitment to achieve results in 2015. So we are happy when they reaffirm something that they already promised in the past. That would be the best outcome of the September summit. That is not very encouraging. What might not be very encouraging either is what I heard so far was that more than 100 world leaders will attend, but that not many European leaders will attend. I understood that already Bundeskanzler Merkel and Prime Minister Cameron have indicated that they will not fly to New York. So we will see a very bleak picture of the European leadership in climate issues, because we will see an outgoing president of the Commission, and we will not see the most important leaders of the European Union member states. My question to Jos Delbeke is what the Commission is planning to do about that. Is it going to try to put more pressure on the EU heads of state to attend the September summit? My other questions concern more the internal European process. Of course, it's very unfortunate that we have no European common position in September. So what is Mr. Barroso going to tell the world about the European position, besides the fact that we do not agree and that we let Poland hijack the whole climate debate in Europe for the last couple of years? So that would be my question. What is Mr. Barroso's message there? Another question is, what are the intentions of the European Commission for the coming weeks and months? What kind of proposals can we still expect, next to the energy efficiency proposals that we expect today? And finally, is there any news on the Fuel Quality Directive, Mr. Delbeke? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Eickhout has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I must say I very much agree with my previous colleague, Jan Gerbrandy, that I must say when I hear Mr. Delbeke talk about the New York summit in September, it seems it's going to be a very painful meeting for Europe. Because you could say that Barroso I, more or less the only thing that happened under Barroso I was the climate and energy package for 2020, and that under Barroso II, Europe gave away that lead that we had under Barroso I again. So at the end of 2 Barroso terms, we have not much. And I think this is going to be the last meeting internationally of Barroso talking on climate, and probably it seems he's going to be there empty-handed, which is going to be a very painful meeting for Barroso. So I must say, Mr. Delbeke, I'm very much disappointed if I hear you that indeed the most important ambition is going to be to reaffirm something that was already being reaffirmed previous times, several times before. And what is Europe going to pledge in New York? It is a month before we are having our new EU summit in October, so then probably the EU can say something about 2030, but this is also the moment where the Commission now one day can really state something. I mean, Barroso will be out anyhow a month later, so maybe for once, just for once, the Commission can take a leading role and can really say something which they think what their member states should be doing. Since indeed not many heads of state will be there of the EU in New York, this is a moment where Barroso can really state what he thinks, instead of just always the blah blah we are used to of Barroso, which is unfortunately also coming out of your mouth, Mr. Del Baker, just now. If that's going to be what Barroso is going to say, that Europe has done so much nice things until 2020, if that rhetoric, which is a recording record for ages now, if that's going to be the speaking notes for Barroso in New York, I would say maybe Mr. Barroso could stay just back in Brussels and will save the trip. So if he goes there, then I would expect him a bit more stronger and a bit more better on what to do there. What is Europe going to deliver for 2030? And on the financing, where the developing countries now are for years, for decades, are asking Europe, not only nice words, but also delivering something, what is Europe going to pledge there? Is Europe going to push for international instruments to make sure that the financing will be there in 2020? Because now, until now, every climate summit is going to be a reiteration of national pledges, of a bit of money for developing countries, but there is no concrete proposal for a continuous flow of money, which we need through an instrument, for example, through aviation or maritime shipping for payments. These kind of things I would expect from Europe to really push for instruments that are delivering longer-term financing and not only the yearly pledges which are unpredictable and which are always usually in the hands of the ministers of finance in the EU. In short, Mr. Del Baker, what is Barroso going to do there? And is it going to be more than just saying that Europe is such a nice place and was leading? Because it was leading. It's not anymore.
Grazie.
Thank you. Ms. Wicker has the floor.
Hvala lijepo, gospodine predsjedniče. Nisam sigurna da gospodin De Becker može dati odgovor na ova...
I'm not entirely sure whether Mr. Del Baker could answer the question our colleague put, but I do agree this is a question that does need to be raised. I also agree that Paris presents a major opportunity for us, and we have to put right the mistakes that were made in Copenhagen. Whether it's going to be Barroso or somebody else representing the EU, well, whoever it ends up being, the EU must represent the interests of the Commission and this Parliament. And our committee, in the last legislature, entered into and agreed on 3 binding commitments. And quite irrespective of how ambitious those goals were, I think they are achievable by 2030. And we've heard that the 2020 goals have pretty much already been attained. And there isn't really a problem, therefore, to attain the 2030 goals as well. Obviously, without a control mechanism, you might miss those targets, so we do need to ensure that we have such a mechanism. And I also agree that developing countries need to be given a helping hand, and I think it's an important factor because developing countries simply don't have the wherewithal to get themselves moving, and we need a mechanism by means of which we, the developed countries, can help them. But there is a risk, and this is a risk that we discussed in the last legislature, namely that aviation and shipping emissions represent a risk and one we need to do something about. At the end of the day, it's important, however, that we just do good preparation for the summit and that the Paris meeting goes off well so that we don't have the same tragedy that we experienced in Copenhagen.
Thank you. Mr. Scott has the floor.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wenn man Just Del Baker so
Thank you. Listening to Joost de Baker, you might say the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak, to coin a biblical phrase. Now, when it comes to energy efficiency, an issue raised by Peter Liese, it seems the Commission is lagging behind Parliament so much, but it's a issue of the 2020 target as well. Too many certificates may be issued, and then you'll only postpone the problems. So I'd like to know how international partners are going to react to that. And it's also been alluded to that some member states aren't playing ball. President Barroso and the Commission perhaps need to coordinate better. Also on financing, in the last summit we saw that every member state came up with its own figures and didn't coordinate. So I'd like to see better coordination as far as the financing is concerned by means of the European Commission, and then it might add up to something. Otherwise, we'll just be meeting behind the doors and we won't hear what goes on at the conferences and we won't have any credibility. There'll be a lot of parading of things at conferences, but a lack of action. And the Commission wouldn't be responsible alone for that, but also the Member States. I think we would suffer a loss of credibility, which would not be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Balzo has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also like to thank the Director for this very detailed information. I would like to have two questions, and possibly I would like to have your answer, Mr. Chair. First, about the ambitious European targets. It is very correct that the EU is not only paying lip service about cutting emissions, but takes measures and demonstrates results. The question is, what are the limits of these ambitions? I heard that by 2020 the emission reduction could be as high as 40%. But here we are talking about a global problem as well, because it would mean that Europe, which is responsible for emissions up to 13 or 14%, no matter how much it reduces emissions, the global situation will not improve greatly. It can only be improved if the US and China make their own commitments and also act. So I do agree, Mr. Director, that the most important task would be to convince the leaders of the EU to make a substantial contribution and drive to encourage the US and China to make their own commitments. My second question relates to nuclear energy. We who are sitting in this committee are all committed to the increased use of renewable energies. There are countries, however, where the nuclear power is a determining factor in the total energy mix, for example in France or in Hungary, where it is about 40%. And there are certain plans to maintain these percentages. My question is this: do you agree that maintaining safe nuclear capacities could be a positive step in the light of climate change? Thank you.
Thank you.
Abbiamo fatto un po' di confusione perché
I think we got a little bit confused because the proposal made earlier was 40% energy efficiency rather than production of sustainable energy. But obviously, afterwards, the Directorate General of DG Klima will answer himself. Ms. Rice has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je crois que c'est moi.
Thank you, Chairman. It is me, isn't it? Just making sure. Two brief questions, because obviously the Director already has a lot of questions that have been put to him, some of which cover my points. I was very pleased to see that we're starting this work in our first Environment Committee with this subject, which is one where the European Union has proven its expertise and that it's a pioneer, even though it's been said. Obviously, this is a desire that is more evident in Parliament and Commission rather than Council, and that's been the case for some time now. So, obviously, the New York summit and then Lima at the end of the year are crucial and of vital importance for setting ambitious goals for Paris and avoiding a repeat of Copenhagen. Some comments have already been made saying that negotiations were starting on the wrong footing with the Polish government, which wasn't being a team player exactly. But, as has already been said, I think we do have reason to be quite optimistic, or at least not totally pessimistic, because the two main regions that emit emissions, namely China and the US, do seem to be changing direction, and that was one of our questions. It was mentioned by the director, and maybe he could come back to how that is happening, how things are moving on that side. And then part of the experts of the Convention of the UN on Climate Change have already said that we have made more progress for Paris 2015 than we were at the same stage for Copenhagen. So I think that this augurs well. Plus, the director did insist that we are already almost about to reach our obligations for 2020 for CO2 emissions. So all of these are very positive points. So my questions. Well, in Lima, obviously, we are going to be talking money as well. So where have we got to with the financing of the Green Fund, which is of vital importance, obviously, for helping southern countries when it comes to combating climate change? And then maybe a more political point, and maybe as well to sound out general feelings. I heard that we're going to be having Representative Ms. Barroso with Ban Ki-moon, and for Lima, perhaps we could have an indication on how Europe will ensure that it's consistent. We know that we were characterized by cacophony in Copenhagen, and that actually determined greatly to what was called the failure of negotiations. So what is the general feeling now about us managing to achieve some consistency in what we say, some unity of expression? What can we expect? Thank you.
Grazie, ovviamente mi scuso per...
Thank you. I would apologize if I said your name English style, but gradually I'll get to grips with all the names. Ms. Grostet has the floor. Thank you very much, Chairman. Many points have already been raised, but it's true that we spend our time discussing climate issues which are of vital importance, and really I have the impression that we are reliving debates that we had last time round. And it's true that we're quite right to say how disappointed people were by Copenhagen and how disappointed we all were at that point in time, how discouraged. Nonetheless, I think we need to be realistic and do everything to ensure that there are firm commitments amongst our partners, obviously. However, I do have a few questions. I think we also need to avoid there being too much confusion in terms of the percentages that we mention when it comes to energy efficiency and renewables and reducing CO2 emissions. Because yes, we've committed to 40% for energy efficiency, and that's excellent, and we shouldn't at all cede on that. Then on the other issues, I think we should nonetheless recall that Europe may be a pioneer in the field of climate, but Europe isn't perfect. And I would recall that there is a report, a recent report, saying that 70% of energy sector emissions in the world come from coal electricity plants. And we have amongst the most polluting plants in the world. Some of them are located in Europe, in Germany, in Poland, in the United Kingdom, and in other member states. So there, we do definitely need to make efforts ourselves to ensure that these plants, well, I'm not saying, obviously, that we should stop people from using coal as a source of energy. Each member state is perfectly free to decide on its own energy mix. But there are methods, there are technologies that need to be further developed that do exist. 8 years ago, we already committed ourselves, or rather 6 years ago, in 2008 to this particular issue, and I'd like to know exactly how much progress has been made. For example, in the storage and sequestration of CO2. That was talked about recently, but how much progress has been made in that field? I think it's important also that if we want to be listened to by our partners, that we can prove that we ourselves are putting our houses in order, that we're making progress with technology. There's research too into energy storage systems. How can we ensure that our renewable energy systems are efficient? They're not, so they're subsidized because they're not profitable, and they're not profitable because we can't store the energy from them. So let's make efforts there, and let's then pass that technology on to our partners to improve the climate. So I really would like to hear a bit more about just how far we've got with those technologies, whether we've made progress or whether we're just skating. Then I'd also like to have some information on the capitalization of the Green Climate Fund. That was to be discussed in Lima, we've heard, but I'd like some more information on that point. Thank you.
Grazie alla collega e adesso.
Thank you, colleague. Mr. Reck from the GUI.
Ja, danke, Herr Präsident. Ich habe einige Fragen.
Thank you, Chairman. I have some questions to the Commission. In 2007, the UN released a report on the long shadow of livestock. Dr. Kleinfeldig worked on that, and in that report, it emerged that over 18% of emissions harming the climate were from meat production, rearing of animals. So I'd like to hear to what extent the Commission has looked at that, and also the UN Climate Conference, and in the preparatory meetings, be that for Lima or Paris. To what extent will that be on the agenda? It's an important issue which needs to be included in considerations to ensure that the warming of the climate is limited to 2 degrees. Thank you.
Grazie, abbiamo un'ultima.
Thank you. One last request for the floor from Pedicini.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to speak to support the colleague sitting alongside me. I, of course, agree on the objectives which we've set, very ambitious energy efficiency objectives, but there is a degree of contradictory behaviour in some countries which are working in a way which means that they rely on nuclear production. So I'd like to raise an issue of concern to Italy, which is going to be a concern to us up to 2020, namely fossil fuel use. Italy is talking about doubling oil production, both onshore and offshore, compared to the current levels. On top of that, in Italy, they're looking at something which has just been discussed now, such as the technologies which are obsolete in the rest of the world, such as fracking, a highly polluting method of production which will have a major impact both environmentally and in tourism terms, because if they extract the fuel, it will be off the shores of Calabria, Puglia and Sicily in the Adriatic. So I'd like to know how are member states going to get beyond that, given that things like renewables and energy efficiency are so important. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie. Abbiamo così.
Thank you. That concludes the round of speakers, and I think, as a whole, what we've seen emerging from what colleagues have said is an invitation to the Commission to adopt a stronger stance. Also, a number of selective, targeted questions have been asked, and I'd like, because of the little time available, for the Director now to answer. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, the most overriding question is perhaps what is my President going to say at the Ban Ki-moon summit, and I don't know, I cannot read his mind, but I think he will say that the EU has a standing record on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Under the Kyoto period number 1, there was a commitment by the EU to reduce emissions by 8% between 2008 and 2012. The EU reduced its emissions with 18%. Now, apart from this first period, we engaged in a second period, and now we are about to conclude the targets for 2030. And these targets are going to be a 40% reduction, which is 20% more compared to 2020, a 27, 28, or at least 27% target for renewable energy, and today there will be an outcome on energy efficiency, and I don't know what my commissioners are going to decide, but I think it's going to be higher than 25%. So let's see what comes out of this debate. But I think that the EU has a standing record in reducing its emissions, and we are world leaders into that. The greenhouse gas intensity per unit of GDP has been halved since 1990. And I think that is being noticed in the world, and that is why the EU is talking to a lot of states in the world, not just to negotiate, but also to implement already actions in the field. And for example, with China, there are 7 pilot projects on emissions trading. These pilot projects have been set up with significant support by the Europeans and by the European Commission. And a lot of insights and software has been shared with the Chinese authorities. So the fact that today in Shenzhen, indeed, prices on the market are twice as high as in Europe, I think is an indication that others in the world are following what we have been doing. And of course, the prices on our carbon market are low, but for that reason, there is a proposal on the table in which we hope that the European Parliament and this committee is going to come forward very soon with its position. So when it comes to core measures that we have been taking in the EU, such as on ETS, we get followers, not just in China, but also in Korea, also in California, also in the United States, elsewhere. Coming to the United States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is preparing now legislation. There has been a court case on whether the EPA was having the power to do that. That question is now out of the way, and the EPA is preparing its proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from power stations and to address, in particular, old coal-fired power plants. And we know that they are moving out of operation in the United States fairly soon. So the United States pledged a 17% reduction in Copenhagen and is about to deliver that pledge as much as we are delivering our 20% for 2020. So the important question that Mr. Barroso is also going to put on the table, I think, is that it is important now that more countries in the world are stepping up their ambition level. Because as was said, indeed, due to our policies, but also due to our specialization in low carbon goods, the part of the emissions of the EU in the world is shrinking from 13% today to close to 10% or below that by 2030. So we will only master climate change if other players in the world are going to come along, and that is why the new negotiations for the Paris deal should have one word that is the key word, and that is participation. More countries have to participate in the emission reductions, and that may require some concessions, and I think that it was said what is it that we are going to commit in Paris? Is it not going to be a dilution compared to what we agreed under Kyoto? Well, it may be that it is somewhat less stringent compared to Kyoto, but we are working very hard to have the core of that Paris Agreement, the core being meaningful emission reduction contributions, and second, a negotiation outcome on monitoring, reporting and verification. That is the hardcore of the Kyoto Protocol, that we all are very transparent with what we do and that we all can control and check with one another what we are doing. So this MRV, the monitoring, reporting and verification requirements, are very much at the core of what is being negotiated towards Paris and is going to be, as we were told, a very important element of the negotiators' text that is going to be on the table for Lima. So wider participation, having our heads up of what we did, acknowledging that we can do much more. That's what we are committing to, the 40%, but having a transparent system on MRV is going to be core to the negotiation we are having between now and Paris. There was several questions on climate finance, whether it is leading towards emission reductions and to what extent on the Green Climate Fund we are making progress. On the Green Climate Fund, indeed, the capitalization now can start. All administrative requirements have been fulfilled and the Green Climate Fund is now up and running, and capitalization should be on its way and is going to be a major requirement in view of the Paris Agreement. But perhaps more important is on whether the climate finance we have been spending already today in the world has been leading to real emission reductions. And I'm heartened to see that as part of the debate on the Green Climate Fund, there is a debate about performance-based checking. All finance that is being transferred, is that finance being well used, and how can we have mechanisms in place to have that more performance-based? And we do that already with the monies that the European Commission is spending as part of its development cooperation, where performance-based is a very important criteria, also as part of the Global Climate Change Alliance that we are having as part of our development cooperation. It is performance-based. There is a check on whether it is really being done what was meant to be done. There was a question on the energy mix. There were several questions. There was the question related to the role of nuclear, of the role of coal, of the role of oil and gas, and of shale oil and shale gas. The energy mix is a competence of the member states. So it is not for the Commission to dictate or to say, or for the EU institutions to say what member states should do and should construct their energy mix. That's a national competence, and that is going to be a reality for years to come. But what we can be doing, and that is what is part of the 2030 negotiations, is that there is a system of governance being constructed in the field of energy. And we need much more transparency about the plans of the member states, not towards the European institutions, but also transparency towards their neighbours. And I think that that is going to be a major benefit for years to come, not only for climate policy, but also for energy policy. Now, the nuclear decisions that are being planned in Europe are going to be much less compared to what was originally thought, but there are going to be some more nuclear power stations, as we observe. On the use of coal, we see and regret that coal use in the EU has gone up over the last 1-2 years because coal was cheap and the carbon price was very low. And so we hope to address that situation by a better functioning carbon market. There was a question on the role of the carbon capture and storage technology. Some member states are going ahead with experimental plans on that, and the Commission just decided on a grant of up to 300 million euros for setting up a major carbon capture and storage facility in the UK as part of its funding programme called NER 300, the New Entrance Reserve 300. There was a question on agriculture, whether that is part of the international negotiations. It is, but it is unfortunately not yet receiving the prominent place it should have. We are preparing for more information and data gathering in talking to our colleagues managing the common agricultural policy, and also in that pillar 2, quite a number of expenditure should be and is being spent to have farming practices which are much less carbon intensive. We signalled in the 2030 communication as a Commission that perhaps for the future we have to think on a land sector where we would combine emissions from agriculture and forestry in a separate sector, separate from what we are doing, for example, in the field of energy. There was a specific question on carbon leakage. On carbon leakage, we decided in the Commission, and that was endorsed by the committee, that, and it is now up for scrutiny by the European Parliament, that we would continue primarily or basically with the list of sectors that are at risk of carbon leakage between now and 2020. That should calm the minds of many people who are nervous in industry and create space for reflection about how to address the carbon leakage after 2020. Carbon leakage in our assessment did not happen on a significant scale today, but in the light of 2030, and depending on the outcome of the international negotiations, that is very much present in the minds of business leaders, in particular when they produce energy-intensive products and services. So we are very much engaged in the debate today on carbon leakage. We recognise that as a very important element, and we are today handing out to those sectors that are listed on the list of sectors prone to carbon leakage almost half of our allowances under the carbon market for free. There was then also a specific question related to the ratification of the KP2, the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. We are fairly advanced with that proposal. We have 27 member states agreeing to go ahead, but we still are waiting for the agreement of the 28 member states, and we hope that making decisions in October is going to facilitate an agreement by this last member state. There was a question on what specific proposals are on the table and are being prepared by the Commission. Well, what is on the table of this Parliament is the Market Stability Reserve that is going to be extremely important to get the carbon market working again as it was intended to work. We have also a proposal on measuring emissions from the maritime sector. We have, of course, a raft of questions related to the 2030 package, and for that we have to wait for the decisions of the heads of state in October of this year, because following the decisions by the heads of state, then the Commission is going to prepare its legislation on the carbon market, a new version after 2020, if anything needs to be changed on beyond the Market Stability Reserve, but also the effort-sharing decision, and maybe possibly what are going to be EU-wide measures to facilitate emission reduction in the member states. And that relates to cars, that relates to fuels, that relates to biofuels, and that relates to a raft of products and services that may be by times very carbon intensive. For example, the use of air conditioning systems. That may be very negative for the climate. With that, Mr. President, I think I touched upon most of the elements. I may not have gone into sufficient detail, but I would like to reassure you that we are going to have our heads up in the Ban Ki-moon summit in September, because we have a record to show, and the debate related to 2030 demonstrates that we are determined to continue on the way that we have been walking so far. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Direttore del
Thank you, Director. I think in light of those answers you've given us, we can regard this topic as concluded. I see Mr. Nicholson has come into the room, who is rapporteur for the next agenda item that we'll be speaking about, novel foods. And on that note then, I think we can move on to the next agenda item now. As you will all know, the novel food regulation has a complex past behind it in the European institutions, given that in January 2008 the Commission adopted its proposal for a regulation for Parliament and Council, but it did so under the ordinary procedure in the past parliamentary term, and we were unable to achieve an agreement on that basis. And then at the end of the conciliation committee in March 2011, we didn't get a proposal that was accepted by the European legislator, and the procedure was regarded as concluded in the last parliamentary term. A number of topics were left undealt with. There was an issue of conflict of competence between different commissioners, and my predecessor will know that we had long discussions on cloning with the Agri Committee, and this topic is one still open as to who has competence. We now discuss the new proposal which has been drafted by the Commission. I should also emphasise that in the past parliamentary term there were requests for an impact assessment, and today then our work will proceed as follows. I'll give the Commission the floor first, who will take us through their proposal for novel foods. We will then hear from EFSA and the experts there who wrote the impact assessment, and then we'll begin our committee debate. So I'll give the floor straight away to the Commission for a presentation of their proposal. Chantal Bruschi seems to be the name, says the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My name is Chantal Bruschi. Thank you. No problem. I knew it was me to speak. Thank you very much for giving us the floor. Thank you also for putting this important file on the agenda of this committee today. Thank you for the rapporteur, Mr. Nicholson, because as you rightly said, the conciliation failed, primarily for issues linked to cloning. And as you know, we have now drafted this proposal on novel food, which is separate from the two cloning proposals which are also on the table of the Parliament. So it is important to discuss this proposal because actually it takes most of the very good result of the conciliation. And the novel food regulation as it stands today deals with new food which has not been consumed significantly in Europe and which companies would like to put on the market. So the regulation aims at facilitating the marketing of this new food, novel food it is called, while ensuring its safety and of course while helping innovation, including for SMEs. But importantly today, the regulation which is in place is, in the views of many, including industry, NGOs, consumers and ourselves, the public policy makers, as not efficient because the procedures are very long and the approval process is one which goes first to member states and then if there are objections the files are shared between member states, they're sent to the Commission, and then if there are scientific objections, we go to EFSA, etc., etc. So it is a process which takes a lot of time, and everybody concurs that there is room for improvement. So this is why we had this proposal on the table, and as you said, it failed in conciliation, and we have now prepared this new proposal. So importantly, in order to support innovation, it streamlines the process of approval, meaning that the applications are sent directly to the Commission and they are risk assessed by EFSA immediately, instead of going through the two-tier approach which I just described. It improves the efficiency because it will go faster, and it also facilitates, importantly, imports from third countries which are agricultural produce, which have never been consumed in Europe, but as they are agricultural produced, and if they, for example, if they have been consumed for a long period, 25 years in these third countries, we propose to these third countries, mostly developing countries, not to go through the approval process, but to go through a notification, which is a lighter procedure, which should go faster. Of course, member states will always maintain the possibility of objections if there are serious safety issues. And of course, then it goes to EFSA. But to give this possibility to third countries for agricultural produce which themselves have consumed is an innovation in this proposal, which is important. The definition of novel food is also an outcome of the conciliation at the time. What we wanted to do is to simplify and clarify the definition. So it is novel food. It has not been consumed in Europe since 1997, which was the date of the first regulation. It has not been consumed to a significant degree in our member states. And we wanted, in this proposal, to avoid the difficulty linked to categories of novel food. And this is why we have a list, an illustrative list of novel food which fall into this definition. We understand that, of course, there could be misleading because you don't have a clear full list of novel food, you only have an illustration of novel food. And of course, we are very much ready to clarify this definition where it could be misleading. On the procedure also, it is very important to take note that the authorization in the proposal will be generic, which means that SMEs in particular, which have often less the means to go for a full risk assessment, will benefit from the authorization. Importantly, under the current regulation, you also have a kind of procedure which allows other companies to get onto the market of an approved system, but it's more complicated. You have to once a novel food has been approved under the current legislation, a company has to go and show that his product is substantially equivalent to the one which has been approved, which again shows that there is a procedure which takes time, takes money from everybody, and which we now solve by giving a generic authorization. On the procedure also, you may have noted that we have 5 months for EFSA to risk assess, and we also have a maximum of 5 months for the authorization. 9 months, sorry, 9 months. For the data protection, there is a generic authorization, as I just said, but in order to help certain companies which have the capacity or which can invent a food based on their own research and their own data, we propose to them to have a protection. So there will not be a generic authorization. They will be the company being allowed to put the food on the market because they have done their own research. And, of course, they should be entitled to recover the cost. But they must be the owner of the data. They must show that what they have developed inside is the key data which is necessary to approve the novel food. As I said, this proposal is the result of the very good work achieved on conciliation, which you said, Mr. President, where the stumbling block was primarily cloning. We want to improve the current system. Everybody concurs that there is room for doing this. We are keen in speeding up the approval system, in facilitating the market access and, of course, innovation while preserving food safety. We received yesterday, and we thank very much the Secretariat of the Parliament, we received the draft impact assessment, which we read a little bit quickly, but we read it with much interest. And I think I would stop my presentation here and be rather happy to respond to specific questions if there are any. I thank you very much again for having put this on the agenda. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Valery Courtois from EFSA has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for inviting EFSA to this debate and for giving us the floor. I will start to say that EFSA is not involved in developing legislative acts, not being responsible for food policy, but we much appreciated having been invited to this debate. And I would like to highlight some of the current activities and the planned activities we are undertaking for facing the implementation of this proposal when it will come into force. With regard to the current situation, in this decentralized procedure, EFSA evaluates only those applications where the member states have raised objections to the initial assessment done by a competent body in a member state. And as such, it represents about 2/3 of the applications which have been are evaluated by EFSA after having been evaluated once by a member state. So it shows clearly that the new proposal with centralized procedure would speed up the process, and we appreciate that the total time for the scientific evaluation of novel foods applications will be significantly reduced. I would also like to highlight that this service is provided free of charge by EFSA. EFSA doesn't take any fees, doesn't charge fees for any applications in the area of regulated products, and this includes also the novel food applications. We appreciate, as I said, that this procedure, centralized procedure, will speed up the work, but on the other side will also increase the workload of EFSA. However, we have planned that internal staff will be redeployed from areas where the workload will be closed by the date when the proposal will be implemented, so it means that we will not ask for additional staff to complete this work. I would also like to tell you that following the request from the European Commission, we have started to prepare the guidance documents for the novel food applications and notifications for traditional foods from third countries. And these guidance documents are expected to be delivered by EFSA in October next year, of course pending the formal adoption of the new novel food regulation. We also foresee that the guidance documents will be released for public consultation to allow all interested parties to provide comments on the guidance documents. And of course, all those comments will be evaluated as appropriate and addressed in the final guidance documents before publication. In addition, in support to the applicants and also member states or all interested parties, we plan to have in 2016 an information session with, as I said, applicants or whoever would be interested in this, to provide further clarifications on the guidance document and also to give the occasion to applicants to ask more details about and clarifications on the scientific requirements for putting up a dossier for a novel food application. Also, as recently announced by EFSA, in line with the initiatives of EFSA to strengthen the services to applicants, it will be possible in the future that at request of EFSA, the applicants might be invited to provide clarifications directly during the evaluation, the scientific evaluation of the dossier. We are aware that several member states have built capacity and they have good scientific expertise in evaluating novel food dossier in the member states, and we consider that it would be advisable member states to keep their expertise also in the future and to continue to have this advisory role to the applicants. And we also see as a very important point that the member states will need to have the necessary expertise for examining the notifications on traditional foods. We would like very much to make use of this expertise in the member states in the sense that we planned to put up a contract when the legislation will be, when the regulation will be adopted. And we would like to have member states applying for this contract and to support EFSA by producing preparatory work, pre-assessments, and that will be very much appreciated and will speed up our work in addition to the other considerations that are given to this new procedure. We also discussed with the advisory forum last month, and we plan to have a network with the member states where EFSA will discuss with the experts in the member states on the general matters. We'll have a possibility to exchange views and concerns relating to the evaluation of the novel foods. Of course, this novel food network will not discuss individual application. This will be the task of EFSA. But as we have in many other areas in EFSA, it's a very important platform for exchanging views and for collaborating to the member states. Thank you very much.
Ringrazio l'EFSA per...
Thank you very much to EFSA for having given that presentation. And now I'd like to pass the floor to the Centre for the Strategy and Assessment, LADAS, which has 3 representatives, 3 experts here with us. And they will be presenting the impact study that was conducted. You have 15 minutes in total, and you can split that up amongst yourselves as you so wish for the presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting us here this morning to present our complementary impact assessment. I am here with 2 colleagues, Michael Richardson from the same company as myself, and a colleague, Stephen Tompkins, who's from ADAS, which is also from the UK. Yes, we've been asked to carry out a complementary impact assessment. We'll go through the main findings, and my colleagues will be presenting our findings in relation to the various key issues. Perhaps I could ask somebody to move the slides on. Thank you. And the next slide, please. We were given a brief which consisted of 3 main aims. Firstly, to review the Commission's 2008 impact assessment. Secondly, to look at the proposals which are now on the table and to assess the likely benefits and effects. And thirdly, to look at some of the new material that's been published since the impact assessment was carried out several years ago. On the next slide, please. We carried out a number of research tasks to fulfill these objectives. This included a fair amount of desk research, looking at position papers and various other documents, but then also an interview program which covered both the European Commission and other EU-level bodies, including the EFSA, but then also the member states, including national authorities, and both sides of the sector in this area, namely the industry, associations of various types, including representatives of SMEs, but also consumer associations and third country stakeholders. Just very briefly on the key issues that we've been asked to look at. I won't go through these in any great detail because I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to deal with each of these in turn. But there were 5 main questions covering the scope and definition, the impact of more centralized authorization procedures for novel foods and how effective that is or is likely to be, the role of member state authorities in this new setup, and the interrelationship with other regulatory requirements. Just a couple of final words before I hand over. We presented a draft report which I think is available. That will be finalized in due course after this meeting and other consultations. And we're, of course, available for any further questions. I'm going to hand over now to Stephen Tompkins to go through the first of these questions to give our conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Jack. Next slide, please.
So the first issue that we looked at was the scope and definition. Obviously, we've been told already that the new definition of novel food retains the date of the 15th of May 1997. Anything before that date is considered a novel food. However, it subsequently removes the categories as well. This, in principle, is a good idea because it takes account of new products coming onto the market in the future. However, we did find when we spoke to consumer representatives and industry representatives that there are many diverging views here. From an industry point of view, the perception is that this new definition will mean that potentially hundreds of thousands of products may now require an authorization as a novel food. If you remove the categories, it basically means in their eyes that anything before the 15th of May 1997 could potentially be considered novel, and things that were never perceived to be novel before, and examples were given such as fruit, new varieties of fruit achieved by traditional breeding programs would suddenly be considered novel. Now, whether the Commission intended this or not, this will obviously create huge administrative burden if applicants are going to the European Commission to get clarification, and legal uncertainty for operators. From a consumer point of view, the perception was almost the opposite, in that if you have a very wide definition, it means that there are potentials for loopholes, and things that are considered novel may be able to get through without an authorization. Clearly, these diverging views are bad for the proposal, and our main recommendation here is that there should be more dialogue between the European Commission, other public bodies, industry representatives, and consumer organisations to really understand what the impacts of this new definition are. And next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So the impact of the centralised authorisation procedure, we've heard that the authorisation procedure will now be carried out. The initial opinion will be by EFSA for a start. This cuts out the member state assessment at the start of the process. Now again, this is a good move. It means that we lose time off the novel foods application. And whilst before there may have been hundreds of scientists looking at a document, we now have less scientists. The process is more streamlined. However, we must remember that there are still many possible areas within the authorisation procedure where there could be delays. The comitology procedure is still very slow. Applications can be held up in the standing committee. Our main recommendation here is that if the European Commission are really serious about having a very dependable process for applicants that adheres to strict timetables, then perhaps more deadlines in different stages of the process are needed. We also heard about the new simplified notification procedure for traditional foods. Again, this is welcomed by all. If you have a food from another country that's considered safe if it's been used in a large part of the population, then naturally it should have a more simplified risk assessment procedure. However, particularly stakeholders we interviewed from third countries thought that this may be of limited value because it only applies to foods derived from primary production. Most novel foods will have at least gone through some processing at some stage, and therefore the objective of having a simplified procedure may only be of limited value if it's only applicable to a few applications. Similarly, if we have data requirements to provide a history of safe use, to provide a notification, proving a history of safe use is notoriously difficult. There are many discourses in the scientific literature about this. And our main recommendation here is that the data requirements need to be more clearly set out for providing a history of safe use, so that it avoids the use of lots of reasoned objections by member states and avoids the process just becoming as long-winded as a normal novel foods application. Next slide, please. And again. So we looked at the costs and resources to submit a novel foods application. We couldn't really make any conclusions here because this will completely depend on the EFSA guidance for applicants, which we heard is coming out in October of next year, so we'll reserve judgment on that point. Generic authorisations were talked about. In principle, again, this is a good move because it means that, particularly for small companies such as SMEs, they won't have to go through a full authorization procedure if other companies have done it for them, essentially. However, clearly to make a generic authorization procedure work, you have to have robust data protection mechanisms. There were some concerns from industry, particularly, that the data protection regime sometimes cannot be granted, especially if a large company, for example, has worked with an academic organisation, as they frequently do, to help produce data. If that's been then referenced in a scientific publication, it may mean that a data protection licence cannot be granted. Many large companies do work with academics, which means that if a data protection regime doesn't work as fluidly as it should, if it doesn't get granted in as many cases as it should, this obviously defeats the object of having the data protection regime. Next slide, please. And again.
Thank you, Stephen. So moving on to the role of national authorities and agencies in the centralised system. As stated in the proposed regulation, Member States' role would be limited to voting in the standing committee to ultimately authorise the placing on the EU market of novel foods based on the EFSA's safety assessments and opinions. Most of the stakeholders interviewed, including Member State authorities themselves and the EFSA, said that they would like Member States to assist the EFSA in carrying out safety assessments by providing their own knowledge and expertise, and this would also help secure consensus on decisions when it comes to voting in the standing committee. On the other hand, it's not possible to predict at this stage how likely Member States are to raise reasoned objections regarding traditional foods from third countries, as this will very much depend on the quality of the data provided by applicants in relation to the notion of history of safe consumption. Next slide, please. So the recommendations that emerged from the research were that Member States should be involved in safety assessment procedures as far as their expertise allows them to do so, to improve the effectiveness of the centralised system, but also the scientific credibility of the EFSA's assessments and opinions. And, excuse me. And the risk of Member States raising reasoned objections on a fairly frequent basis would need to be mitigated by putting in place precise and rigorous quality standards for the collection of data on history of safe consumption, and also by further clarifying the notion of history of safe consumption. So if we move on to the last key issue we examined, so the relationship between the proposed regulation and other EU food regulations. Well, a number of issues were raised by the industry representatives we interviewed, and also by the EFSA around novel foods which present nutrition or health claims, as these novel foods would have to undergo two separate and distinct assessments. One of them would be an assessment required by Regulation 1924/2006. There is also a 5-year data protection period that applies to health or nutrition claims. But the problem is that it is quite challenging for companies to submit separate sets of data at the same time, data relating to the safety of the product in relation to a novel foods assessment, and data relating to health claims, as such data in relation to health claims is often obtained from carrying out clinical studies, which can take quite a long time to complete. So the problem is that if these two separate assessments were to be carried out at different points in time, the respective data protection periods would not that the dates of the respective data protection periods might not coincide, and this could be problematic for companies, and it could potentially be a disincentive for companies to apply to place novel foods on the EU market. Similarly, there is a risk of duplication regarding the assessment of novel foods which contain nutritional or dietary substances, as such novel foods would have to undergo another safety assessment by virtue of Regulation 609/2013. But this safety assessment is very similar to the novel food safety assessment. So according to interview feedback, that there's a strong argument for combining both procedures or both assessments into one, or at least for ensuring that both procedures run in parallel to avoid unnecessary duplication. One last issue that was raised also by consumer associations was that at this stage there is no harmonisation at EU level regarding the status of botanical substances and ingredients. And in other words, certain botanical substances may be considered as foodstuffs in some member states, whilst in other member states they would be considered as medicines. And this could cause problems in a centralised system because decisions might be blocked as a result if novel foods with novel foods that contain botanical ingredients. So the recommendations that we came up with were that if possible, safety assessments and health claim assessments for novel foods should be carried out simultaneously, so that the respective data protection periods can start and end on the same dates. If these two distinct assessments were to run consecutively, then special arrangements will need to be considered to achieve coherence between the respective data protection periods. With regard to nutritional or dietary substances, more comprehensive EFSA guidance would be needed so that to avoid unnecessary duplication of safety assessments. And finally, the lack of harmonisation with regard to the status of certain botanical substances and ingredients would need to be carefully considered to ensure that this will not affect the effectiveness of the new centralised authorisation procedures. So I'll hand over to my colleague for some concluding remarks.
Well, there you are. That's a brief overview of our complementary impact assessment. I think we more or less kept within our time, and obviously we're available to answer any questions if you have some. Thank you.
Grazie, vi ringraziamo per...
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for presenting the results of the complementary impact assessment, and thank you as well to the Commission and EFSA for their comments too. And now I would like to pass the floor to Jim Nicholson, who is the rapporteur in the European Parliament on the regulation on novel foods.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. First of all, can I apologise for not being here at the beginning. I was up the corridor in agriculture coordinators. As we know, there's lots of duplication of committees in the House this week. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for a very insightful presentation that we've had here today. I think we've seen highlighted some very significant areas of concern, and look forward to hearing from my shadow rapporteurs and other colleagues in this committee. Before we open the floor to some extent, maybe I could just add a few words, and I'd like to be very brief to pick up on three recommendations from the impact assessment. These are areas I believe will require significant amendment through the European Parliament report. And one is the definition and scope. The proposal has spectacularly failed to achieve its objective of clarifying the scope and definition of novel foods. It is clear from both impact assessment and my own discussions with public and private stakeholders that no common consensus has yet been reached regarding the interpretation of Article 2 and the definition of a novel food. The removal of categories has caused significant unease amongst the industry, and while I accept that there must be flexibility in order to avoid gaps in the scope in regulation to innovative products, I find it extremely difficult to accept the Commission's current proposal, which is devoid of any categorisation. While this is, of course, an important discussion that we had within this committee, and indeed the workshop at the workshop, I would consider the more sensible course of action to reintroduce the categories in an updated form, which will hopefully future-proof them against unanticipated industry developments. As far as data protection is concerned, fostering innovation within the industry is another key objective of the proposal. I welcome the Commission's recognition of this through the provision of the protection of the proprietary data. The impact assessment has nevertheless highlighted the twofold weaknesses of the 5-year period proposed by the Commission. Firstly, we must address the industry's concerns regarding the coordination of data protection periods for nutrition and health claims and novel foods. EFSA must not waste resources on nutrition and health claims. Applications which will not succeed as novel food applications, nor should the data protection period be rendered worthless by uncoordinated applications. And secondly, the notion of right of reference relating to confidentiality of proprietary data must also be considered. We must not preclude the extremely effective and valuable collaboration between our industry and our universities. It is hugely important that the connection continues and is not restricted unnecessarily by the novel foods regulations. On deadlines, I would like to pick up on one of the final aspects of the impact assessment, which recognises that there are still many stages of the application process without deadlines. I have no doubt that this will subvert the objective of a swifter authorisation process for novel foods. We must look again closely at the proposal to identify the areas which can be subject to deadlines in order to fully realise the desire to speed up the application process. Certainly the time taken for the Commission to deliver an opinion could be shortened from some 9 months, from the proposed 9 months, and I would also consider setting a deadline for the Standing Committee decision. That's all I would like to say, Mr. Chairman, for the moment, and I'd like to hand it back to you and no doubt listen to my shadow rapporteurs and other colleagues in the committee. Thank you.
Grazie, James. Adesso,
Thank you, James. I'll now take contributions from the shadows. Pilar Ayuso first.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you also to the Commission, to the EFSA representative, the assessors, and Mr. Nicholson. As you said, it's the third legislature that this is a subject that we've had on the table, and let's hope that we can go more quickly, partly with the experience we all have now, in that we tend to be the same rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs as last time round, so let's hope things will go more quickly. I totally agree with the approach that's been adopted by the rapporteur, Mr. Nicholson. I think the most important point ahead of us is the whole question of definitions. The definitions are of vital importance. That was mentioned by the assessors too, because otherwise we could get a great deal of legal insecurity, and so we have to be extremely clear. We also have to be clear on the procedures that should be used for nanotechnology. On foods from third countries, theoretically, we would agree because the proposal makes sense, but we have to take into account that the requirements for third countries are not necessarily going to be the same as our requirements, and the procedures that are used for foods or how those are conserved are not necessarily going to be the same too, and that has to be taken into account. Then data protection. I would also agree with what was said on the whole question of the academic organizations involved in research. I think this is normally the case, that the food industry has some very strict agreements ensuring that this data is for their exclusive use rather than for the academic institution, which doubtless would of course be being paid for the work. Then, I think it's an excellent idea and an excellent proposal that SMEs should be able to group together to present a proposal on EFSA. There is no doubt that EFSA will have more work, and we did in fact mention that when we were talking about the budget. So this is an issue that needs to be settled. The EFSA representative said that this will be free and that no fees will be paid. Well, if that's the case, and if they're going to have more work, and if their budget's going to be reduced, well, that seems to me to be a situation where it's going to be very difficult to square the circle. And this is something that needs to be tackled and settled and taken into account. And what I would ask for EFSA is that it make very complete proposals, because otherwise we are going to see a series of problems such as we're seeing currently with the health claims. If things aren't clear, then industry finds itself in a very problematic situation. And then on other regulations, GMOs, obviously not actually a problem here, but there is a possibility of links, and you may have different procedures, and as such you may need authorization for novel foods at the same time being requested. Anyway, when you have files that coincide in time, then we also need rules so as to ensure that they do genuinely coincide in time and that one isn't dealt with to the detriment of the other. And then I did have a specific question on novel foods that are authorized or notified under Articles 4, 5, 6 of the regulation of 97. Are these going to be included in one single list? And as such, does that mean that the applicants won't be included and that they won't receive protection, therefore, such as that for the novel foods that are authorized under the new regulation? I don't know whether the Commission is imagining that there should be a transition period or whether they've got a solution for those kind of foods, in particular when it comes to the 5-year exclusivity period for data protection. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Adesso.
Thank you. Mrs. Auken, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a little word in general on the impact assessment. We still in the Greens have the feeling that you put business in centre much more than consumer protection, and we might look further into this in the upcoming debate to have the consumers and people in focus more than business. Just that in general. Then on the Commission's proposal, we have a few remarks. On the clone foods, we have concerns with the fact that clone foods is explicitly excluded from the scope. In order to avoid a regulatory gap, we have to make sure that appropriate transitional provisions ensure at least basic requirements are met until the new cloning legislation enters into force. The requirements currently in force are far from being appropriate, but they ensure at least that food from clones cannot be put on the market without application and following an authorization procedure. If we exclude cloned food from the scope, even food from cloned animals could be placed on the market without anybody noticing. On nano, we had a discussion earlier this year about the threshold for labeling nanomaterials within the food information to consumers regulation. The definition is currently under review, and we still have serious concerns, but this is a separate issue. As for the threshold, the definition within the FIC defines engineered nanomaterials as intentionally manufactured materials within 50% or more of the particles are in the size range from 1 to 100 nanometers. The Commission now proposes to apply this definition also for novel foods. However, in this case, it's not about labeling, but about risk assessment. Even EFSA recognizes uncertainties and recommends a 10% threshold for food-related applications. If the 50% threshold was applied, not only for labeling purposes, but also within the novel food regulation, there's a risk that some nano-ingredients will not be captured by the definition and therefore not fall under the scope of novel foods. That means it will not be the subject to risk assessment and pre-market approval. When it comes to risk assessment, which is the case in the novel food regulation, we should therefore adopt a more conservative approach and refer to the 10% threshold recommended by EFSA. And the third part is about the implementing acts. We cannot accept implementing acts for deciding whether a food falls within the definition of a novel food. European Parliament has always insisted on delegated acts when it comes to defining what falls in the scope of legislation. The same applies for updating the Union list. We cannot agree on implementing acts there. Why should novel foods be authorized without scrutiny by the European Parliament, whereas all food additives, enzymes and flavorings are? Even the old Commission proposal from 2008 provided for updating the Union list with EP scrutiny. It's not comprehensible why the Commission now proposes a procedure without veto right for the European Parliament. Thank you, Mr. President.
Grazie, non essendo...
Thank you. Since no one else has asked for the floor... Oh, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank the Commission, EFSA and the Centre for Strategy and Evaluation Services and ADSA for their presentations. I would share the concerns of GMOs and cloned foods being taken out of the proposal, and we would hope that they will be dealt with separately and very much appropriately. I suppose just want to raise some concerns on this proposal from the Commission, and I've read through the impact assessment and a few issues jump out at me. Firstly, when we are discussing the traditional food from a third country and the requisite history of safe use of 25 years, I think we should be looking for a more concise definition of the history of safe use. For example, if the Commission receives data from a producer seeking to place a traditional food from a third country, how will the Commission be able to clarify that this data is reliable? What methods will they have? I suppose as well the simplified procedure, the leaving vague and undefined criteria for history of safe use leaves opportunities for a lot of reasoned objections defeating its purpose. So I certainly think we need to tighten up the criteria and the definitions within the proposal. As I understand the authorisation procedures in the new proposal, applications will no longer be sent to Member State authorities and then on to the Commission, which will circulate the application to other Member States, but it will be a case of the applications being made directly to the Commission and then the EFSA for risk assessment. The aim of this change, I understand, as being one of reducing time, but however, as highlighted in the impact assessment, it is often not the time of the process that matters most to applicants, but the predictability of the process. And I welcome the comments from EFSA regarding Member States' expertise, but I would still have my concerns that we're considerably reducing the role of the Member States to be involved in safety assessments and the approval or disapproval of novel foods, especially when we are unsure of whether or not that EFSA and the European Commission will have the capacity to be able to efficiently deal with the amount of applications. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Grazie alla collega Boylan. Adesso...
Thank you, Mrs. Boylan. I'll now give the floor to the Vice Chair.
Chair. Já budu nový v tom týmu, protože včera...
I will be a new member of the team. I've been appointed shadow rapporteur yesterday for S&D. And I must say that I had the possibility to study the complementary impact assessment overnight. And partly I had the chance to read the document itself, and I have been frightened just as much as I was frightened last year when I got the PRM material. What kind of a proposal is it if we need to change the definitions in order to make clear what falls into the scope of the proposal, in order to make clear that all this makes sense? How are we supposed to take a position on this proposal when the artificial threshold of 1997 might mean hundreds of thousands of foodstuffs becoming novel foods? How are we supposed to deal with the huge uncertainty about the impact of the centralized procedure? On the one hand, there are concerns of a huge growth of administrative burden, and on the other hand, there are concerns that some substances which might be risky or dangerous might not fall into the scope of the legislative at all. So, right now I am really frightened, and I do believe that in team with Mr. Nicholson, my frightenment will change into happiness about the great work of the experts of the European Commission.
Thank you. I shall now give the floor to the representative council.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. By including this item on the agenda, this Assembly has demonstrated a great interest in this topic, which is also decisively important for the Italian presidency. I'd also like to thank the Commission, the committee, and its rapporteur, Jim Nicholson, for all the work it's done to try and make some progress on this file, and to try and strike a balance after the experience of the negotiations in 2009 and 2010. That experience then allowed us to explore in detail the package as a whole. I certainly believe it's very useful that we're having this debate with a view to the tasks ahead of the Italian presidency, and also with a view to an agreement that we hope will come as early as possible between the different institutions. In terms of the Council's work, I can inform you that the Greek presidency already had the issue discussed a number of times, and after that exercise it will be incumbent on the Italian presidency to define further those questions which seem to need further exploration. The definitive version of the list of new food products and the definition of nanomaterials feature first and foremost there. From our point of view, we are determined to tackle this issue as it requires, with all due caution that the exercise demands. And we can assert that we'll certainly pick up on all the opinions and ideas that have already been expressed here by the members of this committee who have spoken. So we're certainly fully committed to this, and we absolutely want to work with you across the board in Parliament. This is a very important benchmark for us. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Grazie alla Presidenza italiana.
Thank you to the Italian presidency. I don't know if the experts want to add anything or if they wish to answer any of the points raised. I'm asking them if there's anything they need to add. No. So then I'll give the floor first to the Commission and then to our rapporteur to wind up the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you also for this very useful and important debate. Maybe on the definition, of course, it is not the intention of the Commission to include novel food which had not been considered novel food in the past. And as I said in my introductory remarks, it was the result of the work on the conciliation, and we are most devoted to clarify the definition and to make it work both for consumers and for businesses to have the legal security and to understand what is novel and what is not. So the intention is absolutely not to cover retrospectively any food which would not have deserved being considered a novel food, but to clarify the categories. I give you one example. Under the current regulation, for example, proteins derived from insects are considered novel, but the whole insect is not novel. There is no logic in this, and this is because the wording of the current regulation, the category says ingredients derived or something like that. So it shows that as soon as you start describing in detail a category, you fall into grey areas which may become difficult. So that was the intention of the legislators at the time, and indeed we are most ready to help and improve the understanding of the scope, both for the consumers who want to be informed and want to have safe food on their plates, and for the businesses. On the list, yes, there will be a single list, and importantly today, many food are subject to substantial equivalence. So when an operator has received the approval of a novel food, there are already a number of other operators which also market this food because we have this procedure of substantial equivalence. So it makes a lot of sense to have one single list once this new regulation comes into force, and to have the past approved foods considered all as generic. This is for sake of clarity and also to not to have this complicated substantial equivalence procedure. I would also like to reassure the members of this committee that the food from clone is excluded in the proposal because we admit at the time we were making the proposal is that the food from clone is dealt with in the separate legislation. Of course, if the separate legislation is not adopted at the same time as this one, we should keep the food from clones within the scope of this regulation, so there is no legal void. And we know there has been no request for putting this food on the market, but still, it is very important it is subject to this regulation, as long as the other legislation specific on cloning and on food from clone is not adopted. GMOs have always been excluded from this regulation, and they remain excluded because they are covered by separate legislation. On nano, we find it appropriate, again, both for consumer information and for businesses, to make reference to an existing definition, even if it exists for labeling purposes, because it's a very technical and scientific definition per se, and we cannot change it because this is the way nano is. So we find it extremely important not to have separate definitions of nano in a single sector, namely food, which differs according to the regulation. It's important to remain as coherent as possible with a technically defined legislation. If, of course, there should be slight differences, we could see, but it must be clear for everybody, both for consumers and businesses. Of course, the Member States' expertise, as EFSA has explained earlier, will remain. Of course, everybody agrees that they should be streamlined, and EFSA, also on other files, collaborates closely with Member States' scientific agencies. And on the health claims and the novel food, I think it's important to take note that the health claim legislation is a legislation which is on whether a food can be said it is good for your bones or for your heart, or it decreases, it prevents diseases. So this legislation on health claims is applicable to any food. It is an authorization of the efficacy of a food. So it is not linked exclusively to novel food. So it is important that this legislation exists separately. And when it happens to be on novel food, it is important to know that the regulation on novel food deals with the safety of the food, and the health claim, the efficacy of a claim. And there is a distinction between the two. Of course, they can be interlinked, but it's first, before you have a claim, you need to be sure that your new food is safe. So there is a link between the two, but the steps are not necessarily in parallel. They can be also consecutive. So this is an element maybe which we could also clarify by one way or the other. I think we all agree, but it is important to have these objectives, the objectives of the legislation in mind. I would like to thank again for the very useful debate. We will, of course, continue to collaborate both with the Council and with this Assembly to have a very fruitful outcome, and maybe even a first reading agreement, who knows, because we have all worked a lot already on this very interesting file. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also to the Commission, and then I give the floor for concluding the discussion to our rapporteur, Mr. Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman, and my best thanks to everyone who participated in this debate. I think it's been very useful today, and I believe we have the basis of a significant way in which to move forward. Let me assure you, as far as I am concerned, I am dealing with novel food, not the issue of cloning. That is separate and is separated from this, so I do not intend to get involved in that particular part of that. Debate is in the past, and it's over and done with, and it will be dealt in another area in another way. I'll provide an update on the proposed timetable for the report as soon as possible, and I hope to look forward to meeting you all again at the workshop on the 7th of October, and thank all for involved. Thank you.
Thank you to you, and then with 2 or 3 minutes before we close our meeting, and I give to you the appointment for the family photo at 14:45 here in the committee room. Thank you very much, and see you later.